The rain was a persistent, soft drumming against the thick woolen blanket, a sound Elias had learned to both tolerate and find strangely comforting. Outside the small clapboard cabin, the Pacific Northwest of 1793 sighed and dripped. It was a damp, ancient sigh, woven with the scent of wet cedar, the sharp tang of spruce, and the pervasive, resinous perfume of pine. Elias pulled the blanket tighter, the wool rough against his chin, and listened. The wind, a low moan through the towering evergreens that pressed in on the small clearing, carried with it the distant rhythmic thud of axes and the occasional shout of a man at work. This was Fort Defiance, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness, a fragile bulwark against the untamed. He ran a calloused thumb over a loose thread in the blanket, his mind adrift in the gray, humid air. The day was already forming its usual pattern, waking before the sun, the chill seeping through the floorboards, the preparation of a meager breakfast, typically dried fish, sometimes salted venison if their hunting parties had been successful, washed down with bitter chicory root coffee. Then the endless rounds of labor. Fort Defiance existed for one purpose, the acquisition of furs. Beaver pelts, primarily, their dense, damp-proof fur highly prized in the fashionable drawing rooms of Europe. The logistics of this endeavor were as complex as the dense forest itself, a constant ballet of procurement, processing, and storage, all under the watchful, often unsettling gaze of the indigenous peoples, who were both their suppliers and, at times, their rivals. The sound of the fort stirring grew louder. A dog barked, a coarse, excited yelp. The clatter of metal on stone, the creak of timbers as men began their day. Elias pushed himself up from the straw-filled mattress, the rough wool of his undershirt scratching against his skin. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of dried sweat, wood smoke, and the faint, acrid odor of curing hides. He splashed cold water on his face from a wooden bucket, the shock of it momentarily sharpening his senses. The gray light filtering through the single small window offered little cheer. Another day of damp, of toil, of waiting. The waiting was a constant hum beneath the surface of everything, waiting for the trading ships that would carry their bounty across the vast Pacific, waiting for the hunting season to yield its riches, waiting for the rain to cease, a prayer almost as futile as wishing for the endless trees to simply disappear. He dressed in layers of rough linen and wool, the fabric sturdy but prone to holding moisture. His boots, heavy and oiled, felt familiar, a second skin against the damp earth that would soon surround him. The fort was still shrouded in mist, the towering pines emerging like phantoms from the gray. The air, though cool, was heavy with the promise of more rain. Elias stepped out of the cabin, the dampness instantly clinging to his exposed skin. The scent of pine was stronger here, mingled with the musky aroma of the nearby tannery where hides were being scraped and treated, a pungent testament to their industry. He inhaled deeply, trying to find some solace in the wild, untamed beauty of it all, a beauty that was also the source of their constant struggle. The central courtyard of Fort Defiance was a tableau of controlled chaos. Mud churned to a slick brown paste by countless boots, and the constant drizzle coated everything. Around the perimeter stood the essential structures, the main storehouse, its timbers stained dark with age and weather, the blacksmith's forge, where sparks occasionally flew even in the dim light, the mess hall, a long, low building that usually smelled of stew and wood smoke, and a scattering of smaller cabins like Elias's, housing the handful of men who constituted the fort's permanent staff. Beyond these, the forest began, an impenetrable wall of green and shadow. Elias's task this morning, as it often was overseeing the processing of the pelts that had been brought in by the hunters the previous evening. He made his way towards the long, low shed dedicated to this purpose, the air growing thick with the coppery scent of blood and the musky odor of raw fur. Inside, the scene was one of laborious efficiency. Men, their faces etched with concentration, worked at long wooden tables. Some were carefully scraping the inner membranes from beaver skins, their knives moving with practiced precision, careful not to pierce the precious fur. Others were stretching the hides on wooden frames, pegging them taut against the damp earth outside the shed, the tiny holes creating a delicate lace along the edges. The process was painstaking. Each pelt represented days, sometimes weeks of risk and effort. The beaver, a creature of the waterways, was notoriously wary. The hunters, often accompanied by indigenous guides whose knowledge of the terrain and animal habits was indispensable, would track them for miles, setting traps in their lodges or along their runways. Then came the arduous journey back to the fort, carrying the heavy, damp pelts. Elias paused, watching a man named Silas, his strong hands covered in a thin layer of grit and fur, meticulously work on a particularly fine beaver skin. Silas was a veteran of the fur trade, his face a roadmap of scars and sun-baked lines, his movements economical and expert. The air in the shed was close and humid, the rain seeping in through gaps in the wooden walls. The men worked in near silence, their efforts punctuated by the scrape of knives, the rustle of fur, and the low murmur of instructions. Elias felt the familiar ache in his shoulders, the tension in his lower back. He'd spent years performing these tasks, the physical demands as constant as the damp. He moved from one station to another, offering quiet guidance, checking the quality of the work, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. A poorly scraped pelt, a hide stretched too loosely, could significantly diminish its value. He noticed a small group of indigenous traders arriving, their canoes silently gliding into the small inlet near the fort. A ripple of activity passed through the men. This was the core of their operation, the delicate dance of trade. Elias straightened, a familiar sense of anticipation mixed with caution settling over him. The relationship with the indigenous peoples was paramount, a complex tapestry woven with threads of mutual dependence, respect, and occasional distrust. They were the ones who knew the land, who could navigate its secrets, and whose skills in hunting and trapping were unmatched. The arrival of the canoes brought a brief flurry of heightened activity. The indigenous traders, primarily from the Salish or New Chonolth peoples, were skilled navigators and traders, their imposing cedar canoes laden with the fruits of their labor. They beached their vessels with practiced ease, the dark, sleek wood a stark contrast to the rougher timbers of the fort. The men disembarked, their movements fluid and purposeful, their faces often impassive, revealing little of their thoughts. They were dressed in woven cedar bark or cured animal skins, adorned with intricate carvings and shell work. The air, already thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, now carried the subtle, earthy aroma of their clothing and their presence. Elias met them at the edge of the clearing, a small, polite smile on his face. He understood only a few words of their languages, and they in turn knew some rudimentary Chinook jargon, the common trade language of the region. Gestures, expressions, and a shared understanding of the currency of furs and goods bridged much of the linguistic gap. He acknowledged their arrival with a nod, his eyes scanning the canoes for signs of the prized beaver pelts. The trading commenced at a designated area near the storehouse. The indigenous men began unloading their wares, bundles of cured pelts, intricately carved wooden bowls, fishing spears tipped with bone, and sometimes intricately woven cedar mats. Elias's role was to assess the quality of the furs, a task that required a keen eye and years of experience. He would pick up a pelt, feel its weight, examine the density and length of the fur, and check for any signs of damage or insect infestation. The value was determined by these factors, a silent negotiation conducted through the presentation of goods. The Europeans offered manufactured goods in return, metal tools like axes and knives, which were highly prized for their durability. Glass beads in vibrant colors that fascinated the indigenous peoples, woolen cloth, often in bright reds and blues, firearms and gunpowder, a potent and sometimes dangerous commodity. The process was slow, deliberate, and often involved much back and forth. Elias would offer a quantity of beads for a certain beaver pelt, and the trader would counter with a demand for a knife or a longer length of cloth. The atmosphere was charged with a quiet tension, While trade was generally peaceful, misunderstandings could arise, and the inherent power imbalance was always present. Elias was keenly aware of this, his respectful demeanor a conscious effort to maintain cordial relations. He watched for subtle cues, a slight shift in posture, a tightening of the jaw, a prolonged silence that might indicate dissatisfaction. The rain continued its soft drumming, creating a muted soundtrack to the exchange. The scent of pine, ever present, seemed to deepen with the humidity, a constant reminder of the vast, wild world that surrounded their fragile trading post. The rain was a constant companion, a gray veil that softened the edges of the world and intensified the sense. Elias found himself drawn to the periphery of the fort's activities, seeking moments of quiet observation. He often stood near the edge of the clearing where the dense pine forest began, the towering trees forming an imposing living wall. The air here was cooler, and the scent of pine needles, crushed underfoot, mingled with the damp earth and the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves. He watched the indigenous traders as they prepared to depart, their canoes being loaded with the goods they had acquired. Their movements were efficient and coordinated, a testament to their deep connection with their environment and their mastery of navigation. There was a certain grace to their departure, a quiet dignity that Elias found both admirable and enigmatic. They would disappear back into the vastness of the forest and the sea, leaving behind the fort to its own lonely existence. Once they were gone, the fort settled back into its routine, a rhythm dictated by the demands of the fur trade and the unforgiving nature of the climate. Elias's duties were varied. He might spend hours in the storehouse, meticulously cataloging the incoming pelts, ensuring they were properly dried and treated to prevent spoilage. The storehouse was a dim, cool space, its walls lined with shelves and racks, the air heavy with the scent of cured furs, a dry, animalistic musk that was both pungent and strangely comforting in its familiarity. Or he might be tasked with overseeing the repairs to the fort's palisade, the rough-hewn logs that provided a rudimentary defense against both the elements and any potential threats. The work was physically demanding, involving the felling of trees, the shaping of logs with axes, and the arduous task of lifting and securing them in place. The sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine would fill the air during these times, a stark contrast to the damp, settled atmosphere of the rest of the fort. He often found himself reflecting on the isolation of their existence. Fort Defiance was a speck of human endeavor in a colossal wilderness. The nearest European settlement was weeks, if not months, away by sea. Their connections to the outside world were tenuous, dependent on the infrequent arrival of trading ships. This isolation fostered a sense of camaraderie among the men, a shared understanding of their common predicament. Yet it also bred a certain weariness, a quiet longing for a different kind of life, a life that felt more connected to the rhythms of civilization. The rain, a constant gentle pressure, seemed to mirror this feeling of confinement. It was a physical barrier, limiting their movements and making the tasks more arduous. But it was also a cleansing force, washing over the land and imbuing the air with its unique, refreshing scent. Elias would often stand by the edge of the fort, his face turned upwards, letting the cool drops fall on his skin, finding a strange peace in the pervasiveness of the weather. The rhythm of the fort was a slow, persistent beat, a symphony of creaking timbers, dripping water, and the muted sounds of labor. Elias's days were measured by the changing light, the steady fall of the rain, and the tasks that needed to be done. He was part of a small, tight-knit community, a dozen or so men bound together by shared hardship and a common purpose. The constant dampness permeated everything, their clothes, their bedding, their very bones. The scent of pine was a constant, a powerful aromatic presence that clung to the air like a damp, green cloak. One of Elias's most critical responsibilities was the maintenance of the fort's supplies. He spent a considerable amount of time in the storehouse, a dimly lit sanctuary of barrels, crates, and neatly stacked furs. The air inside was cool and dry, a welcome respite from the perpetual dampness outside, though it held its own distinct aroma. The musty, leathery scent of cured hides mingled with the fainter, spicy notes of stored provisions like salt pork and dried biscuits. He would meticulously check the inventory, ensuring that the dwindling supplies of flour, salt, and gunpowder were accounted for. The arrival of the trading ships was a lifeline, and their departure left them vulnerable, reliant on their own resourcefulness and the unpredictable generosity of the indigenous hunters. Elias would inventory the finished furs, each beaver pelt a potential fortune back in Europe, carefully wrapped and stored to protect them from moths and moisture. The thought of these precious commodities, so hard-won, traveling across the vast ocean to be exchanged for silks and jewels, was a distant, almost unreal concept in the face of their daily struggles. He often found himself lost in thought as he worked, his mind wandering to the world he had left behind. The bustling streets of London, the warmth of a hearth fire that wasn't fueled by damp wood, the laughter of people who didn't carry the constant weariness of survival. But these thoughts were fleeting, quickly dispelled by the immediate demands of the fort. His hands, roughened and calloused, were his connection to this harsh reality. They sorted, they measured, they mended, they protected. The scent of pine was a constant presence even within the storehouse, seeping in through the cracks in the timber walls, a reminder of the immense, untamed wilderness that lay just beyond their fragile defenses. It was a scent that spoke of resilience, of ancient growth, and of a power that dwarfed their human endeavors. Elias would sometimes pause his work, close his eyes, and inhale deeply, letting the potent fragrance fill his lungs, a strange comfort in its immutability. The days blurred into a continuous cycle of labor, punctuated by the persistent drumming rhythm of the rain. Elias's tasks were varied, each contributing to the fragile ecosystem of Fort Defiance. He might find himself assisting the blacksmith, the acrid smell of burning coal and hot metal, a stark contrast to the pervasive dampness, the sparks flying like fleeting fireflies against the gray backdrop. Or he might be out with a small group, tasked with gathering firewood, the crisp snap of twigs underfoot a welcome change from the squelch of mud. The forest was a constant presence, its towering pines and dense undergrowth forming an impenetrable barrier. The scent of pine was everywhere, a pervasive, resinous perfume that clung to their clothes, their hair, their very skin. It was a scent that spoke of the wild, of untamed beauty, and of the relentless, life-giving and life-taking power of nature. Elias found himself increasingly attuned to its subtle variations, the sharp, clean tang of freshly broken needles, the deeper, earthier aroma of the moist bark, the sweet, almost medicinal scent of the sap. One particular task that required Elias's attention was the upkeep of the traps. The hunters, both European and indigenous, relied on a network of carefully set traps to procure the furs that were the fort's lifeblood. These traps, made of sturdy wood and iron, needed to be regularly inspected, reset, and repaired. Elias would often venture out along the well-worn trails, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, the rain misting his face. The process of checking the traps was a solitary affair, a silent communion with the wilderness. He would move with quiet efficiency, his eyes scanning the forest floor for signs of disturbance. The air, thick with the scent of pine, was alive with the muted sounds of the forest, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant call of a bird, the ceaseless murmur of the rain. He would examine each trap with meticulous care, ensuring it was properly set and baited. The success of these efforts was vital, each captured beaver pelt a crucial link in the chain that led to their eventual return home, or at least to the next stage of the long journey towards Europe. There was a profound sense of isolation in these excursions, a feeling of being a small, vulnerable outpost in a vast, indifferent world. The sheer scale of the forest, its ancient immensity was humbling. It was a world that operated on its own terms, indifferent to the struggles and aspirations of the men who sought to extract its riches. Yet, in this isolation, Elias also found a strange kind of peace, a connection to something ancient and enduring, embodied in the timeless scent of pine. The relentless dampness had a way of seeping into everything, including the spirits of the men. Fort Defiance, while functional, was a far cry from comfortable. The cabins were small and drafty, their rough-hewn timbers often slick with condensation. The food, while nourishing, was monotonous. Dried fish, salted meats, hearty root vegetables, and the ever-present chicory coffee. Laughter was a rare commodity, replaced by the quiet murmur of conversation and the ever-present sound of the rain. Elias's duties extended to the meticulous preparation of the furs. Once the pelts were scraped and stretched, they needed to be carefully treated to preserve them. This involved a process of scraping away any remaining flesh and fat, followed by a thorough drying. The air in the curing shed, where this work was done, was thick with a pungent, leathery aroma, a testament to the transformation of animal hide into a valuable commodity. The scent of pine, though less pronounced here, still managed to weave its way in, a constant reminder of the source of their labor. He would spend hours working with the skins, the rough texture under his fingertips a familiar sensation. The process was painstaking, requiring patience and precision. A single mistake could render a pelt worthless. He would feel the weight of the hides, the subtle differences in their texture, and the unique markings that indicated the health and age of the animal. It was a silent language, understood through touch and experience. The European traders, when they arrived, were often a source of both excitement and apprehension. They represented the outside world, a tangible connection to the life they had left behind. But they also brought with them news that could be both good and bad, and their presence often highlighted the harsh realities of their isolation. Elias listened intently to their stories, gleaning what he could of the political shifts in Europe, the price of furs on distant markets, and the general state of the world. The rain, a constant companion, seemed to amplify the feeling of being cut off. It was a physical manifestation of their confinement, a gray curtain that separated them from the rest of humanity. Yet Elias found himself growing accustomed to its presence, to the rhythmic drumming on the roofs, to the way it intensified the earthy scent of the pine forest that surrounded them. It was part of the landscape, part of their lives, and he was learning to accept its dominion. The arrival of the trading ships was an event of immense significance, a disruption of the monotonous cycle of life at Fort Defiance. When the sails appeared on the horizon, a palpable wave of anticipation swept through the small community. The ships represented their connection to the outside world, the conduit through which their hard-won furs would be exchanged for the goods they desperately needed. Elias's role during these periods was one of intense activity. He would oversee the final preparation of the pelts, ensuring they were perfectly dried, bundled, and ready for shipment. The storehouse, usually a place of quiet industry, would become a hub of organized chaos. The air would be thick with the scent of cured furs, mingling with the salty tang of the sea carried on the wind. The unloading of the ships was a complex logistical operation. Barrels of salted provisions, crates of tools, bolts of cloth, and bags of gunpowder would be meticulously transferred from the ship to the shore. Elias would be involved in the inventory and distribution of these goods, ensuring that each man received his allotted share and that the fort's provisions were replenished. The metallic clang of axes and the rough texture of the woolen cloth felt like precious commodities, tangible links to the civilization they yearned for. The interactions with the ship's crew were often brief but significant. They brought news, gossip, and a different perspective on the world. Elias would listen with rapt attention, absorbing every detail of the political landscape of Europe, the latest fashions, and the general state of affairs in the distant cities. The ships also brought a temporary influx of energy, a reminder of the world beyond the rain-soaked pines. As the ship prepared to depart, laden with their precious cargo of furs, a quiet sense of melancholy would descend upon the fort. The connection to the outside world would be severed once more, and they would be left to their own devices until the next ship's arrival. The scent of pine, which had been temporarily masked by the sea air and the activity of the ship, would once again assert its dominance, a constant reminder of their isolation and the enduring power of the wilderness. The rain would return to its familiar rhythm, washing over the land, preparing it for another cycle of labor and waiting. The days following the departure of the trading ship were always marked by a quiet introspection. The fort seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, the silence now more pronounced after the brief flurry of activity. Elias found himself drawn to the periphery of the fort, to the edge of the dense pine forest. The rain, a constant companion, had painted the landscape in shades of deep green and muted brown. The air was thick with the intoxicating scent of pine, a perfume that was both invigorating and strangely melancholic. He often spent his solitary moments observing the indigenous traders who still frequented the fort. Their presence was a vital part of the fort's existence, a constant reminder of the complex web of relationships that underpinned their operation. The Salish and Nuchinalth peoples were masters of their environment, their knowledge of the land and its resources unparalleled. Elias, while respectful, found himself observing them with a mixture of awe and a subtle, almost unconscious sense of otherness. The cultural exchange was a delicate dance, conducted through gestures, shared words, and the universal language of trade. The indigenous peoples brought not only furs, but also intricately carved tools, beautiful woven baskets, and sometimes tales of their ancestral lands and traditions. Elias, in turn, offered manufactured goods, a tangible representation of European ingenuity. He found himself fascinated by the artistry of their carvings, the meticulous craftsmanship evident in every detail. He would often sit by the edge of the clearing, watching them prepare their canoes or mend their nets, the rhythmic scrape of bone against wood a soothing sound. The scent of pine was particularly strong here, mingling with the earthy aroma of their clothing and their cooking fires. There was a deep connection to nature in their movements, a harmony that Elias, despite his years in this wilderness, still struggled to fully comprehend. He knew that their lives were intrinsically linked, their survival dependent on each other. Yet he also felt the vast gulf that separated their worlds, a gulf not just of language and custom, but of fundamental understanding. The rain continued its steady descent, a soft veil that blurred the edges of their differences, allowing for moments of shared humanity amidst the vast, indifferent beauty of the Pacific Northwest.
The logistics of survival at Fort Defiance were a constant, evolving challenge. Elias's duties were multifaceted, often demanding a diverse range of skills. He might be found mending the rough-hewn timbers of a cabin, the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine filling the air as he worked. Or he might be in the small, dimly lit forge, assisting the blacksmith, the acrid smell of burning coal and hot metal, a stark contrast to the pervasive dampness outside. The sparks that flew from the anvil were like fleeting stars against the gray, humid atmosphere. His responsibilities also extended to the preparation and preservation of their dwindling food supplies. The small garden plots, carefully tended despite the challenging climate, provided some fresh vegetables, but the bulk of their sustenance came from dried fish, salted meat, and hard biscuits. Elias would meticulously inspect the stores, ensuring that no spoilage had set in, his hands stained with the faint coppery scent of dried fish. The storehouse, a dimly lit space filled with barrels and crates, held the tangible evidence of their hard-won provisions. The aroma within was a complex blend of dry wood, cured hides, and the faint lingering scent of salt. The rain, a constant presence, dictated much of their activity. Days that were too wet made outdoor work difficult, forcing them to focus on indoor tasks. The relentless moisture also posed a constant threat to the integrity of their buildings and their stored goods. Elias would often find himself checking the roofs for leaks, patching the gaps in the walls, and ensuring that the precious furs were stored in the driest possible conditions. The scent of pine, ever present, seemed to deepen in the humidity, a potent reminder of the immense ancient forest that surrounded them. He would sometimes stand by the edge of the clearing, watching the rain fall, letting the cool drops land on his face. The sound of it drumming on the roofs, on the leaves, on the very earth was a constant, almost hypnotic soundtrack to their lives. It was a sound that spoke of nature's persistence, of its ability to wear down even the most stubborn resistance, and in its steady, unyielding presence, Elias found a strange kind of solace, a recognition of the immutable forces that governed their existence.
The scent of pine was more than just a fragrance. It was the very essence of Fort Defiance. It permeated their clothing, their bedding, the very air they breathed. It was the scent of the towering trees that formed the backdrop to their lives, of the wood that built their cabins and their tools, and of the countless hours spent navigating the dense, resinous forests in pursuit of furs. Elias, after years of living in this environment, had grown to associate it with a complex tapestry of emotions: hardship, resilience, isolation, and a strange elemental beauty. His tasks often took him deep into the woods, whether for gathering firewood, inspecting traps, or scouting new hunting grounds. These excursions were always undertaken with a degree of caution. The forest, while a source of their livelihood, was also a place of potential danger. Bears, wolves, and the sheer disorientation of the vast, trackless wilderness were constant considerations. The scent of pine would be intensified on these journeys, the crushed needles underfoot releasing their pungent aroma, the damp bark of ancient trees exuding a deeper, earthier perfume. The indigenous hunters, whose knowledge of the forest was unparalleled, were their most valuable guides. Elias had learned to appreciate their silent, almost intuitive understanding of the land. They could read the signs of animal trails, predict weather patterns, and navigate through the dense undergrowth with an ease that Elias found humbling. The cultural exchanges during these expeditions were often subtle, a sharing of practical knowledge, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of shared experience. He remembered one particular expedition, deep into the hinterland, where a sudden downpour had threatened to disorient them. They had taken shelter beneath the boughs of an ancient cedar, its massive trunk a sanctuary from the deluge. The rain pounded on the thick needles above, creating a muffled roar, and the air was thick with the combined scent of cedar and pine, a potent, earthy fragrance that filled Elias with a sense of primeval protection. In that moment, surrounded by the ancient forest, the anxieties of the fort seemed to recede, replaced by a profound sense of belonging to something far older and larger than himself.
The isolation of Fort Defiance was not merely a geographical reality, it was an intrinsic aspect of their existence. The days, marked by the relentless drum of the rain and the pervasive scent of pine, stretched into weeks, then months, with little variation. Elias found himself increasingly prone to periods of quiet contemplation, his mind often wandering to the world he had left behind. He would picture the bustling streets of London, the warmth of a crowded tavern, the easy camaraderie of men who shared common experiences beyond the struggle for survival. His duties as a general laborer at the fort were constant and varied. He might spend his mornings meticulously scraping beaver hides, the pungent, musky odor of the raw fur filling his nostrils, a scent that was inextricably linked to the sharp, clean perfume of pine. The afternoon might find him reinforcing the rough-hewn palisade, the repetitive, rhythmic thud of his axe against wood echoing through the damp air, each strike releasing a fresh burst of pine scent. The interactions with the indigenous traders were a welcome, if sometimes tense, interruption to the monotony.
These exchanges were governed by a complex interplay of necessity, respect, and an underlying awareness of cultural differences. Elias, conscious of the power imbalance inherent in their trade, always strove to maintain a demeanor of polite deference. He would observe the indigenous peoples with a quiet fascination, noting their intricate beadwork, their finely crafted tools, and their seemingly effortless connection to the natural world. The scent of pine was a constant, a shared olfactory landscape that bridged the gap between their worlds, a subtle reminder of the land that sustained them all. He would often find himself standing by the edge of the fort, gazing into the dense green wall of the pine forest, letting the rain wash over him. The scent was strongest here, a potent, invigorating fragrance that seemed to penetrate his very being. In this solitude, surrounded by the ancient trees and the ceaseless rain, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. It was a peace born not of comfort, but of acceptance. He was a small cog in a vast, indifferent machine, his life dictated by the rhythms of nature and the demands of the fur trade. And in that realization, he found a quiet, if melancholic, form of freedom. The routines of Fort Defiance were dictated by the seasons and the relentless Pacific Northwest weather. Elias, like the other men, had learned to adapt, to find rhythm within the constant dampness and the pervasive scent of pine. His days were a cycle of labor, of meticulous preparation, and of quiet observation. He might spend hours in the storehouse, the air thick with the dry, leathery aroma of cured furs and the faint, spicy notes of stored provisions, meticulously cataloging the precious pelts that represented their year's efforts. The scent of pine, ever present, seeped in through the rough-hewn walls, a constant reminder of the wilderness that yielded their wealth. His responsibilities often extended to the maintenance of the fort itself. This involved everything from patching leaks in the roofs to reinforcing the sturdy, if rudimentary, palisade that protected them from the elements and the occasional threat of unwelcome visitors. The sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine would fill the air during these tasks, a welcome olfactory punctuation in the otherwise damp, earthy atmosphere. The rhythmic thud of axes against wood was a familiar sound, a testament to their enduring effort to carve out a space for themselves in this untamed land. The interactions with the indigenous traders were a crucial part of the fort's existence. These exchanges, conducted through a rudimentary pidgin language and a complex system of gestures, were always a delicate balance of mutual need and cultural difference. Elias, acutely aware of the potential for misunderstanding, always approached these encounters with a quiet respect. He would observe their intricate beadwork, their finely crafted tools, and their intimate knowledge of the surrounding landscape. The scent of pine was a constant, an olfactory anchor that connected their disparate worlds, a shared element in the grand tapestry of the Pacific Northwest. He often found himself drawn to the edge of the clearing, where the dense pine forest began. Here, the scent of pine was at its most potent, a resinous, invigorating perfume that seemed to saturate the very air. He would stand for long moments, letting the cool rain fall on his face, the sound of it a soothing murmur against the silence. In these moments of solitude, surrounded by the ancient trees and the ceaseless rain, Elias felt a profound sense of connection to the land, a quiet acceptance of his place within its vast, indifferent embrace. The arrival of the spring thaw brought a subtle shift in the fort's atmosphere. The relentless drumming of the rain began to soften, replaced by a more intermittent drizzle, and the persistent scent of pine, while still strong, seemed to mingle with new, fresher aromas, the faint sweetness of emerging wildflowers, the damp earth awakening from its winter slumber. Elias, like the other men, felt a renewed sense of energy, a subtle stirring of anticipation for the warmer months ahead. His tasks, however, remained largely unchanged. The need for furs was constant, and the cycle of trapping, processing, and trading continued unabated. He might spend his mornings meticulously scraping the remaining pelts from the winter's hunt, the pungent, leathery scent of cured hides filling the small curing shed, a smell that was always underscored by the ever-present perfume of pine. The afternoons could find him out with a small group, assessing the condition of the traps, repairing any damage incurred during the harsher months, and scouting for new beaver territories. The forest floor, still damp, would release its fragrant oils with every step, the scent of pine a constant, enveloping presence. The interactions with the indigenous traders took on a slightly different tenor as the weather improved. Their canoes, no longer battling the icy waters, glided more easily into the inlet, and their visits became more frequent. The exchanges, while still conducted with the customary careful deliberation, often felt more relaxed, the shared optimism of the changing season fostering a subtle sense of camaraderie. Elias continued to observe their practices with a quiet fascination, their intricate knowledge of the land and their profound connection to the natural world a constant source of contemplation. He noticed how their movements seemed to flow with the rhythm of the forest, their voices a soft counterpoint to the rustling leaves and the distant calls of birds. He found himself spending more time by the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood sentinel. The rain, though less frequent, still fell, washing over the land and intensifying the already potent scent of pine. He would inhale deeply, feeling the cool, resinous air fill his lungs, a scent that had become synonymous with his life here. It was a scent that spoke of resilience, of enduring cycles, and of a beauty that was both wild and profoundly serene. In the growing warmth of the spring air and the ever-present perfume of pine, Elias felt a quiet sense of contentment, a recognition of the unique rhythm of his existence at Fort Defiance.
The year had turned. The harshest rains had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape saturated and vibrant. The scent of pine, always present, now carried with it a new crispness, a hint of burgeoning life that spoke of the approaching summer. Elias stood on the slight rise overlooking Fort Defiance, the small collection of wooden buildings huddled in the clearing like weary travelers. The faint, smoky aroma of cooking fires mingled with the ever-present perfume of the surrounding forest. His hands, calloused and weathered, still bore the faint imprint of pine sap. He had spent the last year navigating the intricate logistics of the fur trade, the painstaking scraping of hides, the meticulous drying and packing of pelts, the careful inventory of dwindling supplies, the delicate negotiations with indigenous traders, and the endless maintenance of the fort itself. Each task, no matter how mundane, was a vital cog in the machinery of their survival, a testament to their collective effort in this unforgiving corner of the world. He watched as a group of men, their figures silhouetted against the dappled sunlight filtering through the pines, loaded a small boat with cured furs. The smooth, dark pelts, the fruits of months of labor and risk, were destined for the long journey across the ocean, a tangible link to a world that felt increasingly distant. The scent of pine seemed to rise with the warming air, a silent witness to their endeavor. Elias had learned to find a certain peace in the rhythm of this life. The constant dampness, the isolation, the arduous labor, these were no longer obstacles to be overcome, but the very fabric of his existence. He had come to appreciate the quiet strength of the towering pines, their silent endurance in the face of relentless weather. He had learned to read the subtle language of the forest, to understand its moods and its offerings. The fort was a fragile outpost, a testament to human resilience against the overwhelming power of nature. But it was also a place of connection, a nexus where different cultures met and exchanged, however imperfectly. The intricate beadwork of the indigenous peoples, the sturdy metal tools they traded for, the very structure of the fort itself, all spoke of a shared human endeavor. He turned and began to walk back towards the fort, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The scent of pine followed him, a comforting, familiar embrace. He knew that the cycle would continue, that the rains would return, that new seasons would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But for now, as the sun cast long shadows through the ancient trees, there was a quiet understanding,
a profound sense of belonging to this wild, wet, pine-scented world. He was a part of it, and it was a part of him. The logistics of survival had become the essence of his life.